Thank you so much for being here. My name is Chris Avery, and I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to the note in the chat box. Microphones are disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them into the chat. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Elisa Lustig, who is our technical support person today. Please also note that all participants in this webinar are expected to be respectful and considerate toward others per the US GCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide. So I'll kick off our webinar today with a little bit of background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to Kate Marvel and the other chapter authors. Next slide. The U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP, was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to, quote, assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide. The same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on multiple sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators. Next slide. NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was written by over 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive and does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their own risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the GCRA, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. And finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Next slide. So now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. And the report opens with an overview that's followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are the national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions are also discussed throughout the report. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. And we also have 5 new focus features as well. We have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. So now that we've gone through all of that introductory background, it's my pleasure to introduce Kate Marvel, the chapter lead of the Climate Trends chapter, who will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. Kate?
Thank you very much, Chris. I thought I would start by going over our 3 key messages before we do a deeper dive later. So our chapter was organized around 3 key messages. And the first is this: the climate is changing and we know why. By this time, it is just an accepted scientific fact, unequivocal, that human activities have increased atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. It is also absolutely unequivocal that global average temperature has risen in response to this. We know that observed warming over the continental United States and Alaska is higher than the global average. And we've also observed long-term changes in many other aspects of the climate system. Because the Earth system is very complex, very interconnected, this means that changes in faraway regions are virtually certain to affect the United States. Our second key message is this: extreme events are becoming more frequent and severe. Observations show an increase in the severity, extent, and/or the frequency of multiple types of extreme events, everything from heat waves to drought risk to extreme rainfall to more frequent and larger wildfires burning, especially in the West. Our third key message is how much the climate changes depends on the choices we make now. Essentially, the future is in human hands. The more the planet warms, the greater the impacts and the greater the risks of unforeseen consequences. We know that the impacts of climate change increase with warming, and warming is virtually certain to continue if emissions of carbon dioxide do not reach net zero. We believe that rapidly reducing emissions would very likely limit future warming and the associated increases in many risks. So at this point, I will hand it over to my colleague, Abhishek Chatterjee, who will discuss greenhouse gases now and in the future. Abhishek?
Thanks, Kate. So we know, for example, for sure that human activities have caused an unprecedented rise in atmospheric concentrations of the three main greenhouse gases, and that is carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O. So what this figure here shows is sort of the very long-term record of these three greenhouse gas concentrations. The first portion of the figure is actually based on ice core record that goes back 800,000 years, while the portion that is shown in the blue rectangle, that shows the concentration from the current era. So more starting from 1850 onwards. And since 1850, as has been shown in the small rectangular box on the side, the CO2 concentrations have gone up by almost 47%, methane by 156%, and nitrous oxide by 23%. Next slide. Now, the carbon dioxide or any of the greenhouse gases that are being emitted, they contribute to climate change today. And this figure actually captures the annual CO2 emissions from fossil fuel and industries for different countries. On the left side of the figure, the left panel shows the emissions that are happening per year from different countries. So right now, China, for example, leads the total amount of emissions. Whereas for United States, the European Union, and UK, historically, they have contributed to the majority of emissions, but since 2005, we can see that there has been a reduction in the amount of emissions, as well as there are other countries, for example, India, several countries in Africa and South America, that actually also contribute to this total amount of emissions to the atmosphere. Now, again, the right-hand panel now shows the cumulative sum of CO2 emissions. And as you can see that historically speaking, the United States and the European Union and UK have contributed to a large portion of the emissions in the atmosphere. So the key message here is that the present is shaped by the past, and the future global warming depends on decisions made today. Next slide. Now, of the total amount of emissions that are released into the atmosphere, the natural ecosystems, such as the land, the vegetation, or the oceans and the soils, they provide us a discount of around 50%. So almost 50% of the emissions are taken up by these natural systems. However, what we are noticing is that these, both from observations as well as from modeling studies, that there is a decline in the carbon uptake capacity of these natural ecosystems. Next slide. And in fact, as was mentioned, or Kate mentioned in one of her key messages, that as more and more extreme events are unfolding, a wide range of events from droughts, wildfires, insect outbreaks, as well as thawing permafrost. All of them have the potential to release large amount of carbon into the atmosphere. So this figure at the bottom actually shows the amount of carbon that is stored in the permafrost over the Arctic domain. And almost the majority of that permafrost is vulnerable to thaw, resulting in a large amount of CO2 and methane that could potentially be released into the atmosphere. Next slide. And I was going to turn it over to Wenning to talk about the other pollutants.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Kate and Abhishek, for the discussion on the key messages on the greenhouse gas. I want to follow on with the discussion on other pollutants that are often emitted together with the greenhouse gas. Next slide, please. One of those pollutants are the small particles emitted into the air known as the aerosols. For example, the cars that we drive not only just emitting the carbon dioxide, but also those tiny particles in the air. So aerosol emissions often results in poor air quality, causing respiratory problems and contributing to premature mortality and other health problems. Health impacts of poor air quality are not felt equally. One of the key messages of the air quality chapter indicates that communities of color, people with low socioeconomic status, and other marginalized populations are disproportionately harmed by poor air quality. Aerosols also have a climate impact. They can scatter or absorb sunlight, which have a cooling and warming effects, respectively. Aerosols also affects climate through their effects on clouds. Increased global aerosol emissions in the past decades have primarily cooled the planet, partially counteracting the warming caused by greenhouse gases. But compared to carbon dioxide, aerosols are more localized and short-lived. Next slide, please. Aerosol emissions in the US have decreased since the passage of the Clean Air Act and subsequent pollution control legislation. The figure on the right shows the aerosol optical depth trend derived from NASA's moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer satellite instruments, using data collected during from July 2002 to December 2021. Aerosol pollutions over and downwind of the eastern United States has decreased significantly in recent decades, and this decreasing trend is significant at the 95% confidence level. Aerosol emissions have fallen on a global scale, and the location of peak emissions has shifted from US, North America, and Europe to South and East Asia. But wildfire emits a huge amount of aerosols, and there's more and more occurrence of those huge forest fires that worsen the air quality, and climate change only going to make this worse. It's going to contribute to increases in the frequency and severity of those wildfires, and that will worsen air quality in many regions in the US and including Alaska. One of the co-benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is improved air quality, and its health benefits enormous, as stated in one of the key messages of the mitigation chapter. Transitioning to a net zero emissions energy system has a potential to generate substantial air pollution benefits. Estimates of cumulative net benefits by 2050 ranges from roughly 200,000 to 2 million avoided deaths. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenying. I'll take over and talk a little bit about observed and projected climate trends in the United States. So we know that climate change is not just a problem for polar bears, it's not just a problem for future generations, it's a problem for us right now. Climate change is affecting the United States right now. We know that the United States is warming faster than the global average. This is because land warms faster than ocean and higher latitudes warm faster than lower latitudes. We know that areas west of the Rockies are warming more. And the Southeast has experienced less warming, particularly in the summer, due to a combination of natural internal variability, aerosol pollution, like what Wenying just talked about, reforestation, and irrigation. We also know that the characteristics of precipitation are changing. Less precipitation has been falling in the American West, especially in the summer, while the eastern regions are, on average, becoming wetter. Now, we know that in the future, as the world warms, the United States warms too. The United States will warm more than the global average. This is what the United States looks like when the world hits the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold spelled out in the Paris Agreement, as well as the 2 degrees Celsius threshold, 3 degrees Celsius, and 4 degrees Celsius. We also know that the characteristics of precipitation will keep changing as the world gets hotter. Some regions will get wetter, other regions will get drier, and these changes largely scale with the global warming level. However, this is just talking about changes in average precipitation. I'm not talking here about changes in extreme precipitation. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Deepti Singh, who's going to talk about current and projected trends in climate extremes. Deepti?
Thanks, Kate. So yeah, I'm going to share some of our findings on extreme events. So extreme events are kind of one of the main ways in which we experience the impacts of a changing climate. And depending on where you are in the US, you're affected by different types of extremes, but no matter where you are, you're experiencing some changes in those characteristics of extremes. So one of the clearest signals we have is in the characteristics of heat extremes as well as precipitation extremes. The figure on the left, top left, shows the changes in the number of days with temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And these are increasing in the Western US. And in particular, the largest changes are in the Southwest. Parts of the Eastern US and Central US are not experiencing those increases. However, there are different measures of heat extremes. This is just one measure. And if we look at warm nights, those are increasing pretty much across the Western US. Nighttime temperatures are really important for our ability to cope with heat. And rising nighttime temperatures pose impacts or challenges to human health impacts. We also reviewed literature that showed that heat waves, particularly heat waves that last for several days across 50 US cities are increasing. They've nearly doubled over the last 3-4 decades. And we also see, relative to heat extremes, we see actually a pretty uniform increase in extreme precipitation events. So the figure on the right shows us increases or changes in the total amount of precipitation that's falling on the top 1% of heaviest precipitation days. And across the US, every region has experienced an increase in this metric. And this is largely driven by an increase in the frequency of extreme precipitation events, but also moderate increases in the intensity of precipitation events. The largest increases in the Midwest and the Northeast, where precipitation has increased by about 60%. In addition to these changes, we also see changes in other characteristics of extremes. So drought risk over the Southwest has increased over the past century. Particularly, soil moisture conditions have been decreasing in the Southwest. The combination of heat and increasing drought risk are contributing to larger and more frequent wildfires burning across the Western US. And on the flip side, hurricanes are, particularly in the Atlantic region, are intensifying. Although there's no clear trend in the frequency of hurricanes, we are seeing a rapid intensification, intensification of hurricanes since the 1980s, and combined with sea level rise, these are contributing to higher storm surges. They're also, hurricanes tend to sort of have been found to move more slowly, which results in heavier precipitation falling in certain regions. Next slide, please. So these changing characteristics of extreme events are contributing to substantial damages to society. This is a figure that shows the number of billion-dollar weather disasters that's recorded by NOAA. And in 2022, there were 18 such disasters that affected the US. Each of these had at least 1 billion in losses associated with them. And overall, we are seeing an increase in the number of these billion-dollar weather disasters, with about an increase from about one such disaster happening every 4 months in the 1980s to about one happening every 3 weeks in the 2010s. Next slide, please. So with projected warming, even if warming is kept to even if warming is limited to 2 degrees Celsius, we are expected to see an intensification of these observed trends. In particular, we're likely to see more heat extremes that affect the Western US and the Southern US, fewer cold days, and an increase in warm nighttime temperatures. We're also expected to see an intensification of the extreme precipitation events, including an increase in their frequency as well as their severity. And this is reflected in a number of the changes in various storms, which are likely to become more dangerous, from atmospheric rivers that affect the Western US to hurricanes that affect the Eastern US. And as the frequency of these extreme events increase, there's a kind of higher likelihood that these events will interact, and there's a higher chance that they would happen at the same time or happen back to back within a short period of time, which can exacerbate the impacts that these extreme events pose to human health, infrastructure, and our ability to respond to these events. Thank you.
Let's turn it over to Alex Roble, who'll talk about sea level rise.
All right, thanks, Kate. Next slide. Okay, so looking at the oceans and our nation's coasts, this map shows a combination of measurements from satellites. That's the color that you see over the oceans. And then in situ tide gauge measurements of local water level along the US coasts in the colored circles. And they generally tell a consistent story, which is that sea level has been rising globally over about the last century. In the US since about the 1990s, which is the period that is covered by this map, the rate of sea level rise in the contiguous United States has been rising faster than the global average. So global average sea level rise has been about a little over an inch per decade, and in the US it's closer to 2 inches. Okay, next slide. So this rate of sea level rise over the last 30 years or over the last 100 years is expected to accelerate, and it has been accelerating and is expected to continue accelerating in the future. So the current best estimate is that, or the current best projection is that there will be at least as much sea level rise in the next 30 years as there was in the last 100 years in the United States. And this varies from region to region. So in the past, sea level rise along the US East Coast, particularly in the mid-Atlantic and along the US Gulf Coast, has been rising faster than in the US on average, but particularly faster than on the West Coast and Alaska. And this continues, this sort of spatial variation in the rate of sea level rise will continue into the future. So on the left, you can see sort of projected sea level rise for the next 30 years in the contiguous United States. So this is about 1 to 2 feet on average across the United States, but in the northwestern Pacific Northwest coast of the United States, this might look like 6 to 12 inches of sea level rise in the next 30 years, whereas in the western Gulf Coast of the United States, this could be up to 2 feet in the next 30 years. Next slide. So the challenge with sea level rise is that the drivers of sea level rise, which are the warming of the oceans and the melting of glaciers and ice sheets around the world, which contributes to sea level rise here in the United States, even if those changes did not originate in the United States, is that sea level will continue to change in response to global warming that has already occurred and global warming that is projected to occur over the next few decades to century. It will continue to rise for at least hundreds to thousands of years into the future. And so looking beyond the next 30 years, we know that the global warming levels that we experience now and that we experience over the next few decades determine the rate of sea level rise or the amount of sea level rise that occurs in the United States past the year 2100. And that is largely because the largest ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctica, they will continue to respond to global warming well past this century. However, the behavior of those ice sheets and exactly what they will do past 2100 is still highly uncertain. So even though we know for certain that sea level will continue to rise, the exact amount of sea level rise that will be occurring past 2100 and its dependence on current emissions is still highly uncertain. So this plot here shows from the last IPCC special report on oceans and the changing cryosphere, shows that as you go a few centuries into the future, while we know it is the case that more emissions now will lead to more sea level rise in the future and potentially quite a bit more sea level rise, talking 10 to 15 feet of sea level rise in the year 2200, 2300. There still are many feet of uncertainty in those projections due to our uncertain knowledge of how ice sheets will behave. And so while we can say with confidence that our current choices will continue to affect our future coastlines for many centuries to come, exactly how much they will affect and how we can plan for that, those changes is still somewhat uncertain.
Thank you, Alex. I'd like to turn it over to Zeke Housefather to talk about the future.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we think we're headed today and some of the findings that we highlight in the recent National Climate Assessment on these issues. If you could go to my first slide. There we go. So one thing that we emphasize in the chapter is that we have increasing evidence, even since the last National Climate Assessment, that the future of the climate is largely in our hands, that the amount of warming that the world experiences is largely due to our choices of how much to emit in the future. And this comes from a lot of modeling done around what happens if we can get CO2 emissions all the way down to zero. And our best estimate across a wide variety of Earth system models is that when CO2 emissions stop, warming more or less stops for the surface of the planet. And that's because of two counterbalancing factors. One is that once we get emissions down far enough, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere starts falling. So this chart is from the most recent IPCC report, Working Group 1, Chapter 4. And the left side shows what happens across a wide variety of models and the average of all the models once we get to zero CO2 emissions. And it shows that, atmospheric CO2 is falling by about 100 parts per million over the following 100 years. However, the Earth is out of equilibrium today. We're trapping a lot of heat in the atmosphere. About 90 or more than 90% of that is going into the oceans. And the oceans have a huge amount of thermal inertia. They buffer the rate of warming of the planet. And so the oceans, particularly the deep oceans, haven't warmed up in response to the amount of heat we're trapping in the atmosphere today. And so the oceans continue to warm up even in a zero emissions world, which does by itself contribute to more surface warming. And so these factors end up counterbalancing each other. Falling atmospheric CO2 would cause cooling, continuing warming of the oceans would cause warming. They nicely counter each other, and so we end up with relatively flat emissions, or sorry, relatively flat temperatures in a world of zero emissions, which is what the right panel of this chart shows across a wide variety of models. Now, there is still some uncertainty in this. Across these models, our estimates are roughly plus or minus 0.3 C or 0.5-ish degrees Fahrenheit, warming or cooling over the next century after the point of zero emissions. And that's an area of active research to try to better constrain. If you go on to the next slide. But while this is good news that we can control the amount of warming the world experiences, that there's not necessarily a huge amount of warming in the pipeline, there's a lot of climate uncertainties that remain, and these uncertainties are not our friends. Now, we emphasize in this chapter, as well as in the mitigation chapter of the National Climate Assessment, that the world has made some real progress in reducing the growth of CO2 emissions. Global emissions have relatively flattened over the last decade compared to the previous decades, and there's been a huge amount of work done by folks like the International Energy Agency, the UN Environmental Program, the folks at Climate Action Tracker, and many other studies in the literature that suggest that we're headed toward a world of around 2.6 to 2.7 C, best estimate warming by 2100 in a current policy scenario. And that's a lot of progress compared to where we seemed to be headed a decade ago, when the central estimate of no policy baseline scenarios, as they were called at the time, was around 4 C warming. And this is largely due to our success in making clean energy cheap worldwide and the adoption of stronger climate policies by many different nations. That being said, 2.6 C is a best estimate, and the climate is a fiendishly complicated system. And so we have not fully been able to narrow down this number. There's a lot of uncertainties of just how the planet will respond to our emissions in terms of how much it warms, what we call the sensitivity of the climate to our emissions, how all the various feedback processes interact with each other, and the temperature we end up getting. And there's uncertainties in how the carbon cycle responds to our emissions. Right now, about half of what we emit to the atmosphere gets absorbed by the land and ocean carbon sinks. That is going to change as the world warms. Those carbon sinks are going to weaken, but exactly how much is fairly uncertain. And so because of these uncertainties in the climate response, we emphasize in the chapter that while we think we're headed toward a world of below 3 degrees under current policies, we can't rule out a world of 4 degrees or even higher if we roll sixes on the proverbial climate dice. It's also very important to emphasize that the world does not end in 2100, even though our models do. And as long as emissions remain above zero, the world will continue to warm into the future. And so even if we're headed toward below 3C by 2100 under current policies, we still may get to very much higher warming levels in the 22nd century if we don't get to zero emissions. And so this further emphasizes the importance of building on the success that we've had so far and further reducing emissions globally in order to stop the planet from warming and stabilize the climate.
Thank you, Zeke. With that, I will stop sharing my screen, and we've moved on to the question and answer part.